Okay, squad, welcome back to the ODR in the front yard, and it's time for the first ranking on the ODR channel, which is also the first installment of Hell's Kitchen Rank the Chefs. And this is a chef ranking for Hell's Kitchen Season 1. Now, just a little bit of a disclaimer before I get into the video. This is a ranking of the chefs based on how I think they performed on this season, not a ranking of how much I like them, which is something I may do later down the line. Before we start, please remember that this is my opinion, and you probably aren't going to completely agree with it, and that's okay. Feel free to post your opinions about the chefs in the comments and also your personal rankings as well. But without further ado, we have 12 chefs to rank, so let's jump right into the ranking. To start off the ranking, at number 12, the worst chef from Hell's Kitchen Season 1 was someone I actually debated on for a while. Most of the lowest placed chefs were in contention for the worst chef of the season at some point, but I did end up choosing the chef that I personally think had the lowest amount of highs across their run and also did the most actively wrong to an extent. Although I think the person I chose might be a little bit controversial. But at number 12, I have Jeff. And Jeff is kind of hard to rank in this season considering that he was in a lot of pain as he was passing kidney stones, but I still think he is the worst chef of the season. It was pretty close between him and the person I put at number 11, but the main reason that Jeff is at the bottom and not the other person is the fact that he couldn't really do well in the dining room either. And this is shown in episode 1 where in his signature dish he serves overcooked steak that, although it has a nice sauce, Chef Ramsay gives it a 1 out of 10, and in the dining room Chef Ramsay tells him after service that nobody liked him, with some of his tables even walking out because of how bad he was. And quite frankly, I do think Jeff should have been nominated over both Carol Ann and even Dewberry. Now, do I think he goes home if he gets nominated? Probably not, but it's still a really bad look on him that he can't get it done in the dining room. In episode 2, he does produce 1 clean squid, but again, so does the entire red team, and then he's on the garnish station for dinner service. And while I do think the abdominal pain from his kidney stones did affect his focus to an extent, he kind of focused a little too much on it to the point where he forgot spinach for one of the tickets and even burned spinach on another one and got called a donkey. And while he does survive over Dewberry, and in my opinion deserved to survive over Dewberry, he's still on pretty thin ice after this due to the fact that he had struggles in the dining room and the kitchen. And it all comes to a head in episode 3 where, despite producing a good dish for the 5-course meal challenge, he's actively hostile with his teammates the entire time, and even actively hostile towards Ramsay during dinner service, with him claiming that he had never worked on a line before, despite him working on a line the previous night. And eventually he completely gives up after calling Chef Ramsay an asshole and quits on the spot, which is a really bad look. Now, I do wonder in part if this was caused by his kidney stones, but I don't think most of it was. It probably played a slight role, but most of it was due to the fact that Chef Ramsay was getting under his skin and he simply just cracked under the pressure. So all of these combined, I do think Jeff is the worst chef from the season, and he's at the bottom at number 12. Up next at number 11, we have the person who people were probably expecting to be at the bottom, but they're one spot above that, and here we have Dewberry, who again is a donkey in Hell's Kitchen, but I do think did slightly more right than Jeff throughout his whole stay. Even though he doesn't get off to the hottest start in episode 1 with his overcooked spaghetti and being slow in dinner service with Chef Ramsay calling him out, I don't think he was the worst chef in the kitchen that night, because yeah, he was slow, but he didn't really make that many mistakes compared to someone like Jimmy or even Jeff, who I just mentioned earlier. And while you could argue he should be eliminated over Carol Ann, which I agree to an extent, I think against Jimmy or Jeff, he definitely stays because, again, he didn't make that many mistakes compared to them. He was just slow during service. Now, obviously, we have to talk about episode 2 for Dewberry, which is a mess, but it actually doesn't start off that bad because in the squid cleaning challenge, Dewberry cleans the most squid for his team and is the only one to clean 2 squids instead of just 1, and that single-handedly wins them the challenge. Before dinner service, Dewberry does produce a spaghetti dish for Chef Ramsay, which he does deem to be nice, and actually does get off to a decent start with the spaghetti dishes, but once he's moved to the meat station, he completely collapses. As while he produces perfect lamb, he produces Wellington that's messed up, and then he needs 12 minutes for the next Wellington, to the point where Chef Ramsay calls him useless and he nearly walks off the line. And by that time, it was pretty obvious that Dewberry was going home. There was no way he could have saved himself after almost walking off the line. He does come back for the finale finale, and despite making some mistakes such as putting fish stock in the spaghetti and also being slow on the ravioli, all this despite him feeling faint because of how hot it was in the kitchen, he doesn't give up and bounces back, even producing a good bass dish to where Ralph calls him the Rock of Gibraltar and the Hope Diamond. So while you could argue Dewberry might be a worse chef than Jeff in the grand scheme of things, I think that might be a valid take. I do think on this season, he didn't do that much actively wrong, besides walking off the line in episode 2, especially when compared to Jeff, who not only actively burned his teammates, but also actively burned Ramsay and quit on the spot. I feel like that was just good enough to have Dewberry at number 11. Up next at number 10, we have another chef who did a lot more wrong on their journey when it comes to cooking and also was eliminated at the first possible opportunity. So I'm a little surprised they're this high, but at number 10, I have Wendy. Now, Wendy does make it all the way to 9th place, and we haven't even talked about the first boot of the season, but I do think Wendy would have been the first boot on the blue team, maybe except for Andrew had they gone to elimination earlier, and she technically is. Now, I will say episode 1 isn't the worst for Wendy, as although she does serve Chinese sausage that's determined to be underwhelming by Chef Ramsay, and she does run out of potatoes, I will say I don't think she was the worst member of the blue team that night, as Andrew began his actively hostile relationship with Chef Ramsay by arguing with him, but as we saw, Andrew made for good TV, so of course he was going to survive if he was put up for elimination, but they win the service, so it doesn't really matter. Episode 2 from Wendy is a lot worse, as she's one of 2 people on the blue team alongside Andrew to have no good squids. And on dinner service, she's on the appetizer station where she gets lost trying to get organized, and even brings up risotto with undercooked rice, to the point where Ralph has to bail her out, which eventually gets the refire accepted, but that was mostly on Ralph and not Wendy. And while she gets off to a good start in episode 3, scoring a point in the 5-course meal challenge over Chris, her dinner service is also pretty bad. She obviously has the iconic line where she says that she thinks cold water is supposed to boil faster than hot water, much to Chef Ramsay's confusion. But even her dishes for the critics aren't that great. When the lobster spaghetti gets to the critics, they think the lobster is too chewy, and when the lamb gets to the critics, it also receives mixed reviews, as one of them liked it, but the other one thought it was quite overcooked. She also got in the weeds over the course of service, as she couldn't get her times together on meat. She got lost on her station trying to make sauce, and Chef Ramsay chewed her out in the middle of service for being pathetic, and after that she was the easy boot. She isn't seen much when she returns for the finale, apart from not having enough pans on the appetizer station and also getting confused about an order, to the point where Ralph has to bail her out again, which along with all the other problems, I think is part of the reason why Ralph lost, because he wasn't running the hot plate as much as he should have been. So overall, I don't think Wendy's run in this season is that great, and she's not that great of a chef, especially when compared to the other contestants on this season, and she also made a lot more mistakes than them during her run up to this point. So she's here at number 10. Up next at number 9, and we are finally getting to the first boot of the season, we got Carol Ann. Now, I actually don't think Carol Ann did that much wrong during her time on Hell's Kitchen. I mean, in the Signature Dish Challenge, she's singled out for having the best dish out of everyone despite not having much kitchen experience. And while she was a little bit slow during service, I don't think she was the worst performer, as she wasn't seen making that many mistakes. And she definitely deserved to survive over Dewberry in that elimination, especially considering everything that had happened beforehand. And in my opinion, she shouldn't have even been nominated that night, because Jeff and Jimmy were the worst performers of the night, considering how many mistakes they made, especially Jimmy. But again, Carol Ann is the first boot of the season, so she doesn't have the longevity factor. As much as I want to put her higher, I can't. So she's here at number 9. Up next to number 8, we have someone who I really debated on for a while, as I think these next 2 chefs are honestly pretty interchangeable, considering that they were eliminated back to back and also had very poor services along their stretch on Hell's Kitchen. So it was a little bit of a toss-up for me, but I decided to go with the person who maybe made slightly less mistakes, but also did a lot more wrong personally during their stint, and that person is Andrew. Now, Andrew is the biggest character of the season, but I really don't think he was that good of a chef on this season. But for me, it's not just his bad cooking that puts him this low, but also his actively bad relationship with Chef Ramsay and even the sous chefs, especially sous chef Scott. Starting off in episode 1, he's the first person to have his dish judged for the Signature Dish Challenge with Andrew's absolute penne, but Ramsay calls it absolute dog shit. And then he tries to ask Chef Ramsay if his dessert's good, despite not going up to the hot plate where Chef Ramsay calls him out for it, and Andrew tells him in the confessional room to keep picking on him because he didn't care. The blue team does win that service, though I don't know how safe Andrew would have been. He likely would have been nominated due to his outburst at Chef Ramsay, though would he have been eliminated? I really don't know. In episode 2, despite him smirking and being all confident, he's one of 2 people alongside Wendy to not produce any good squids in the squid cleaning challenge and is responsible for the blue team's loss. And dinner service isn't much better for Andrew as he's on the meat station with Mary Ellen, and they can't stop arguing even when Mary Ellen tries to get things right by fixing her Wellingtons, and Andrew tried to make himself look good in front of sous chef Scott, much to his annoyance. But then again, the blue team wins the service, so it doesn't really matter. Though I will say, in terms of cooking, apart from the finale, this is Andrew's least bad dinner service. But then episode 3 is another bad episode for Andrew, as he tries to serve Chef Ramsay a grilled ribeye with an oxtail mushroom sauce and white peaches in the 5-course meal challenge, which doesn't work. And for dinner service, Andrew's on the appetizer station and serves crab risotto to the critics, but it's poorly received, with one of the critics even getting sick while eating it. And then he talks back to Ramsay, claiming it was not his fault, which was false, and Ramsay schooled him for it. And he's obviously nominated for elimination, with Chef Ramsay even cutting him off in the middle of his plea, having him start over, but he survives. And even then, I really don't think Andrew was getting eliminated over Wendy anyway, because Wendy was likely much worse than he was. And while the blue team does win the reward challenge in episode 4, he once again has a bad service where he's on the garnish station and he screws up dish after dish, bringing up the wrong garnishes at one point, forgetting the endives when Ramsay wanted him to bring them up, and he's nominated again, but this time he survives, although this time I thought it was a little more questionable that he survived over Mary Ellen, but again, that's subject to debate. And he has another bad episode in episode 5, but like Jeff had in episode 1, he didn't just screw up in the kitchen, he also screwed up in the dining room, with customers giving him negative reviews for his performance. And while the red team tries to sabotage the blue team by having them cook many lasagnas, Andrew doesn't even screw that up. He screws up on the short ribs, with Ramsay calling them a dog's dinner. And I think if the blue team lost that service, Andrew definitely goes, but again, they won that service. And then there's this boot episode, which doesn't start off on a great note, as Andrew goes 1 for 4 on the blind taste test challenge and tries to cheat by taping the door to the wall so they could keep it open and not have to enter the code to get into the storage room, with sous chef Scott catching him and chewing him out for it. And he has another not so great dinner service, as although the entire menu was designed by Ralph, with Andrew trying to have to play catch up, he does bring up perfectly cooked halibut at one point, but he serves it on cold plates and has to do it over. The blue team does recover after Jessica helps Andrew cook the halibut, only for them to come back into the kitchen for being overcooked, with Andrew once again getting upset because it wasn't possible to cook the halibut in just 4 minutes instead of 6. Andrew does get nominated, but Ralph also gets nominated, with Andrew saying that the halibut is his fault as it was on the menu, while Ralph says it was Andrew for cooking it, and Andrew's excuses ultimately get him eliminated right then and there. And while Andrew does come back for the finale, probably performing the best out of all the people in Ralph's brigade, it's not without problems as he does cut himself, but that was more of an accident as opposed to intentional. Overall, Andrew doesn't have the greatest run in Hell's Kitchen, as he makes a mistake in essentially every service. Not just that, but he had an actively hostile relationship with both Chef Ramsay and sous chef Scott, which, although he did try to mellow out by the end, by the time of his elimination it was really too late, as he was easily the weakest member of the blue team and also had some other issues beyond that. So while he's good TV, definitely a character, he's not a very good chef, so he's here at number 8. Up next at number 7, we have someone who I definitely think there is an argument for this person being below Andrew, considering this person made a bevy of mistakes across their Hell's Kitchen run. Despite this, they did seem to be slightly more well-liked than Andrew was, and also didn't have as much of an actively bad relationship with Chef Ramsay, with some exceptions. But we actually have the first black jacket of the group, and here we have Jimmy, who, again, made a bevy of mistakes across his Hell's Kitchen run. Many mistakes, but I think he's just slightly better than Andrew, and I mean slightly. And while he does have a lot more highs compared to Andrew, I'd argue he does have lower lows, but at the end of the day, again, he did make the black jackets, but he does get off to a rocky start, starting with the signature dish challenge where he serves chicken breast with portobello mushrooms and goat cheese, which gets compared to a dehydrated camel's turd. And when it comes to dinner service that night, I do think Jimmy was the worst performer in the red kitchen. He does bring the entree that gets compared to a dog's dinner and gets smashed into him, and when he tries to bounce back, he accidentally burns himself while trying to get a rack of lamb, with Chef Ramsay even calling him out. And even after the service, when he's not nominated alongside Jeff, Chef Ramsay tells him that he dodged a bullet, and quite frankly, Jimmy should have been nominated that night. Episode 2 isn't that bad for Jimmy, where he cleans one squid alongside the rest of the red team except for Dewberry, who cleans 2 squids, and he isn't seen on service that much in that episode, but the red team loses, and he's not nominated, so whatever. In episode 3, he doesn't get off to the greatest start, where he presents a vanilla poached pear, but Chef Ramsay calls it bland, and he doesn't get the point for his team. And again, he's not seen much on service, but the red team wins that service, so again, it doesn't really matter. And then we get into episode 4, which is another not so great episode for Jimmy, where he's on the garnish station. And at one point, he sends cold garnish to the pass, and Chef Ramsay asks him to start over. And he does kind of get bailed out by the red team winning that service. I do think if the red team lost that service, that Jimmy probably would have been nominated. But again, they win the service, so it doesn't really matter. Episode 5 is another bad episode for Jimmy, as he doesn't have issues just in the kitchen, but also in the dining room. When he's in the kitchen, he sends up multiple dirty plays to the pass, with Chef Ramsay getting so angry that he thinks he's doing it on purpose. And then when he's in the dining room as a waiter, JP gets upset with him because he's so sweaty and he's trying to clean it, but it doesn't work. And Jimmy really lucked out that night when Michael chose to nominate Chris instead of him, as I could easily see Jimmy going up that night instead of Chris. In fact, I also see him getting eliminated over Elsie as well, but the main reason he survives is because Michael nominated Chris, and Chris had a huge target on his back for being an executive chef, so Jimmy dodged a huge bullet there. Episode 6 is another bad episode for Jimmy, as he only gets 1 for 4 on the blind taste test challenge, and in the battle of the menu service, Jimmy's on the fish station, and he just screws up dish after dish, bringing up undercooked scallops at one point, and then bringing up overcooked scallops, and the main reason the scallops finally go out is because Michael has to jump in and bail him out, and then when he tries to recover from the scallops debacle, he ends up sending up a penne that's not seasoned properly, to which he has to redo, but by then, it's already too late. And the red team does win that night, but if they lost that night, Jimmy easily goes home, as he was clearly the weakest performer from that night, despite Elsie's paella dish being not so well received compared to the others. And then there's his boot episode, which does start off strong despite him making some careless mistakes and running into the liquor for the flambe challenge. He does end up winning that challenge. But at dinner service, it's really bad. Jimmy's on the fish station once again, and at one point he throws cooked lobster away and can't find it, and then forgets to fire risotto on time, and after adding fish stock to the risotto, he gets into an argument with Chef Ramsay, and at that point, like Dewberry had when he walked off the line, his fate was essentially sealed, and then he's finally taken out. Jimmy does come back for the finale, however, and does okay when he's on the meat station, but then steak comes back undercooked, although his refire does get accepted, and he manages to contribute to Michael's win. So all in all, I actually think Jimmy's run in Hell's Kitchen is pretty bad, as there were multiple points where Jimmy easily could have been nominated and or eliminated for that matter, where in episode 1 he was easily the weakest performer on the red team. Episode 4 was definitely debatable. Episode 5, he should have been nominated and likely goes home if he's nominated. Episode 6 is the exact same story. If the red team loses, he definitely goes home. But I feel there were more services where he didn't do that much wrong, and I don't think he burned Ramsay that much compared to Andrew. So at the end of the day, I thought it was just enough to have Jimmy one spot higher at number 7. Up next at number 6, and we are going backwards in the boot order, back to the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Mary Ellen, who wasn't a major presence on the show, but I think did okay as a whole. Starting in episode 1, she goes second in the signature dish challenge right after Andrew, and she presents an endive salad with toasted walnuts, but Chef Ramsay calls it boring, and she isn't seen on service much that night, but the blue team wins the service, so it doesn't really matter once again. Episode 2 is a little bit of a mixed bag for Mary Ellen, as while she's one of 2 people on the blue team to clean 2 squids alongside Ralph, they do lose the challenge, but it's not anything to do with Mary Ellen, as Wendy and Andrew clean 0 squids compared to her and Ralph's 2. And she doesn't have the greatest service in the world, as she struggles to get Caesar salads ready and also gets into an argument with Andrew over the Wellingtons when Andrew tries to show off in front of sous chef Scott. And this is despite the Wellingtons being cooked by Mary Ellen, so I don't really fault her that much for that argument. And once again, the blue team wins the service. And I don't think Mary Ellen would have been in that much danger had they lost the service. I think the 2 nominees would have been Andrew and Wendy. Episode 3 is pretty much a nothing episode for Mary Ellen, apart from her scoring the point over Jimmy Jimmy in the 5-course meal challenge. But then we get to episode 4, which is not a great episode for Mary Ellen as she's on the appetizer station, and although she gets off to a good start, risottos come back into the kitchen because they were bland and mushy and she has to redo them, and then she forgets tuna for an order as she didn't hear it, and then she also gets confused on the time, which results in the entire table having to be refired. And then the blue team loses and she's nominated, but I do think she deserved to survive over Andrew, as Andrew was clearly the weaker chef up to that point. But she is taken out in the spot mainly due to the fact that Andrew made for much better TV than Mary Ellen ever did, so she's eliminated. As a whole, it's not the greatest run in Hell's Kitchen, but it's also not the worst, especially when compared to the rest of the cast, so Mary Ellen lands about in the middle here at number 6. Up next at number 5, and I feel like these next 3 chefs are pretty interchangeable as there's a pretty clear top 2, but for the other 3 chefs, it's not so clear cut. But after doing a lot of thinking, we are jumping ahead quite a bit in the boot order to someone who almost made it to the end game, and at number 5, I'm going with Jessica, who did get to 3rd place, but I do think her road there is a lot rockier than the other 2 people I considered. She's pretty quiet in the first 3 episodes, but her performances in the challenges are not that great. In the signature dish challenge, she serves crabs cooked Cajun style with a spicy aioli, but the aioli is way too hot for Chef Ramsay to handle, leading to him drinking an entire bottle of water just to wash the spice out. In the squid cleaning challenge, she cleans 1 squid for her team, which is more than Wendy and Andrew's 0 squids, but less than Mary Ellen and Ralph with 2 squids. And in the 5-course meal challenge, she serves Chef Ramsay a grilled pineapple with potatoes, but Chef Ramsay calls her out for not having any idea what she was doing and finding the dish tasteless. Then we get to episode 4, which I will say is a pretty good episode for Jessica. She's on the meat station during dinner service and brings up perfectly cooked Wellington to the pass, although she did need Ralph's opinion on it, even bringing up good lobster spaghetti to the pass, and despite the blue team losing that service, she's named the best of the worst on her team. But then episode 5 is not so great for Jessica as she is insecure in the dining room, having never waited tables before, and in the kitchen she does struggle to keep up with the red team's orders of lasagna, and she also brings up a dog's dinner to the pass like what Jimmy did in episode 1, but the blue team wins the service, so it doesn't really matter. Episode 6 wasn't too great for Jessica, but it wasn't awful either. She doesn't get off to a good start as she misses all 4 foods in the blind taste test challenge, and then in the battle of the menu she's on the garnish station, and Chef Ramsay finds a hair in her food, which is not a great look there. She also helps out Andrew with the halibut, and it gets to the customers, but then it comes back because it's overly cooked. Despite this, Jessica is somehow named the best of the worst because her performance was, in Chef Ramsay's eyes, consistently average. Then we have episode 7, which is the part where Jessica really begins to fall off, and this is also the beginning of Black Jackets, and she gets off to a really bad start during the flambe challenge where she serves raw sugar to Chef Ramsay despite having done flambe before. On dinner service, she's on the meat station and her pan catches fire, which isn't a good look, and then she runs out of filet mignons and gets into an argument with Chef Ramsay, which is also not a good look there, and he yells at her to get back on her station, which she does, only for her pan to catch fire again. And then she's nominated that night, but I do think she did deserve to survive over Jimmy, as Jimmy was the weaker link between the 2 of them, and Jimmy also got into an argument with Chef Ramsay, which was much more heated. Then we have episode 8, which is another really bad episode for Jessica. She gets off to a bad start in the leftovers challenge, presenting a beef stew and strawberry and raspberry cake for dessert, and although the beef stew and dessert were good, the dishes appearance-wise looked pretty bad. And then in dinner service, Elsie puts Jessica on the appetizer station, and she immediately falls apart, screwing up dish after dish, when she sends a salad up to the pass that Chef Ramsay calls shit, and then she needs Michael's help on plating the refires, and then she switched onto the meat station after the service sucks, and then onto the fish station where she has further problems when she needed more time to cook lobsters, to the point where Michael had to stop what he was doing because of Jessica's inability to keep time. And although she sent up a good lobster risotto, Chef Ramsay got angry because it looked like a dog's dinner, and not any dog's dinner, Dewberry's dog's dinner. And then she also gets called out for having a lobster risotto that has a piece of wood in it, which is an even worse look, and then he insults her before the kitchen gets shut down. And I'd argue that Jessica might have deserved to be eliminated over Elsie that night, mainly because while both were bad, Elsie didn't really start getting in the weeds until she was switched onto a different station, whereas Jessica started having problems immediately out of the gate. And Elsie was also sabotaged, which in my opinion makes makes things even worse. I also think Elsie was the better chef up to that point, despite both of them having major hiccups along the way, but nevertheless, Jessica survived the elimination and moved on to the final 3. But as with the previous 2 episodes, the final 3 episode for Jessica is another one that's really bad. In the souffle challenge, she tries to make a raspberry mint souffle, which comes out spongy, and Chef Ramsay even calls it the worst souffle he had ever tasted, resulting in Jessica getting last place and getting stuck with a chicken entree. And while Michael and Ralph come up with their entrees no problem, Jessica struggles before eventually deciding to make a chicken stuffed with goat cheese, herbs, and wrapped in prosciutto. And then in dinner service, she's on the dessert station while also having to cook her stuffed chicken. But she once again has issues with the timing, resulting in the dishes that are on the hot plate at that time having to be sent back into the kitchen and redone. Despite this, her chicken dish gets out to the customers and is well liked, but when the desserts start coming in, she once again has issues with timing, even worse than before, and also starts getting worried about her chicken dish despite not having to cook it as much anymore. She struggles with getting desserts out further in the service and once again struggles on time, which leads to Chef Ramsay getting angry with her for what seems like the 10th time this season at least, and then she even drops a plate, which is not a good look, before trying to get Ralph and Michael to help her out on desserts even though they can't, and then she goes to Chef Ramsay for help, which is an absolute no-no in Hell's Kitchen. She struggles so much with desserts that JP has to leave the dining room to go and help her, and it's not until Michael and Ralph finish with entrees that they can finally help her on desserts, and they essentially bail her out. And by that time it was pretty clear that Jessica was a much weaker chef than Ralph and Michael, and when she only got 1 vote for her chicken dish being the best dish of the 3 compared to Ralph's 3 and Michael's 5, she was eliminated right there. And she did come back for the finale, but she didn't do that great as she had issues with lobster and issues following Michael's orders, despite Michael not being that assertive to start off with. But Michael does win the service, so it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, again. So while Jessica does have some highs during her run on Hell's Kitchen, she also has major lows, especially during the Black Jacket phase, and even going before that to where she had issues with the challenges and even some issues in dinner service as well. So I really can't justify putting Jessica that much higher, so she's here at number 5. Up next at number 4, and it was pretty close between these next 2 chefs and Jessica, as I just mentioned, but it was much closer between number 4 and number 3. So I really analyzed the runs of these 2 chefs, as I feel like it wasn't so clear cut as to who was number 4 and number 3, especially considering that one of these chefs made the Black Jackets while the other didn't, and was arguably a bigger target throughout the season. So it was really close between these 2, but ultimately at number 4, I decided to go with the highest ranked non-Black Jacket in Chris. And as I said, it was pretty close between Chris and the next person we'll be talking about, but for a non-Black Jacket, I actually think Chris's run is pretty good. Now, Chris doesn't get off to the greatest start in the world when he serves Chef Ramsay a salmon on a plank, which later turns out to be raw, and he also flaunts himself as an executive chef, immediately painting a target on his back. And he doesn't have the greatest dinner service in the world, especially when he brings overcooked salmon up to the pass, with Chef Ramsay throwing it back at him, but he's not nominated for elimination and probably wasn't deserving of being nominated anyway. He also gets off to a bad start in episode 2 when he's late for the morning roundup by almost 10 minutes and only cleaning 1 squid in the squid cleaning challenge, but his episode 2 service is actually pretty good as he manages to lead the red team despite them losing, and for that he's named best of the worst. Episode 3 is a similar story where Chris has a pretty poor performance in the 5-course meal challenge, with Chef Ramsay comparing his Dover sole to food that would be served to a sick rabbit, and while he isn't seen that much on dinner service, his team wins the service, so it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Episode 4 is another pretty good episode for Chris, where he takes the leadership role by helping Elsie through her panic attack when the first ticket comes in, and managing to lead the red team to the first victory in Hell's Kitchen history. And then we have Chris's boot episode, which I will say is not a bad episode by any means. This is the pasta night dinner service, and he's on main courses with Elsie, and the main reason I think he got eliminated was for him saying "we chef" to Chef Ramsay, which resulted in Chef Ramsay harping on him, although it could also be attributed to the target that he had on his back for being an executive chef, but also the fact that Michael decided to be strategic with his nominations instead of going based on who had the worst performances. Though I will say this, due to the target that Chris had on his back, I think it's difficult to say if he survives over Jimmy or not. He did also paint himself as the strongest link on the red team that day, doing himself no favors, so there is still the possibility that he goes that day regardless. So all in all, it's not a bad performance by any means. Although his challenge performances were pretty poor, he definitely made up for it in dinner services with his leadership and occasional cooking skills, but mostly his leadership. But I feel like the person I have in the next spot is a lot more well-rounded in those aspects, both in leadership and in cooking, more so in cooking. So as a result of Chris's leadership, I have him here at number 4. Up next at number 3, I thought about putting this person below Chris, but ultimately, given their longevity and more well-balanced skills, I decided to put them one spot higher, and at number 3 I have Elsie. And besides the reasons I mentioned earlier, the main reason I have Elsie above Chris is because she performs better in the challenges and in some cases dinner services than Chris does. She also gets off to a better start than Chris, where in the signature dish challenge, despite her being nervous that her dish was pretty bad, Chef Ramsay says it's not bad. And she also wins the best of the worst in the episode 1 dinner service, where although she does get off to a not so great start with her overcooked risotto, pretty much everyone on the red team had a below average service that night. Carol Ann and Dewberry were kind of slow and lost on their stations. Chris brought up an overcooked salmon to the pass at one point. Jeff couldn't get it together in the dining room, and Jimmy made a multitude of mistakes in that service. So I do give Elsie credit for bouncing back and being considered the least bad of all the chefs in that service, at least on the red team. Episode 2 is pretty decent for Elsie, as well she cleans one squid like the rest of her team, except for Dewberry. On dinner service, she makes another improvement as she manages to work well with Chris winning the best of the worst instead of Elsie, but she does decent enough to where I'm pretty confident Elsie would not have been nominated. She has another decent episode in episode 3 where she makes a salad for Chef Ramsay in the 5-course meal challenge, which she determines to be not bad, and despite burning her hand during prep and not being seen that much during dinner service, the red team wins the service, so it doesn't really matter once again. And while she doesn't have the greatest episode in episode 4, that's mostly due to her letting her emotions get slightly out of control. And once she manages to overcome those problems, she helps the red team finish their first dinner service. However, Elsie has her first bad episode in episode 5, where during the pasta night dinner service, she's on the main courses with Chris, and she gets confused on the ordered items, and also gives Chef Ramsay a bad time, which Chris has to jump in and correct. And she's nominated that night, but I'm pretty confident that regardless of if she was nominated against Chris or Jimmy, she definitely survives that night, as although she did screw up the timing, she didn't make that many mistakes besides that. She also gets off to a really good start in episode 6, doing the best in the blind taste test challenge, getting 3 out of 4 items correct, but her dinner service isn't the greatest in the world, as she makes a paella dish to be featured on the menu for the Battle of the Menu service, and when it goes out to the customers, it doesn't receive very many positive reviews, but the red team wins the service, so as usual, it doesn't really matter. And then we hit the Black Jackets, where Elsie gets off to a pretty decent start in the Fruit Flambe challenge, where despite not knowing what a flambe is, she does really well in the challenge, ultimately though losing out to Jimmy. And Jimmy doesn't pick her for the reward, which really sours her mood. And then he adds further salt to the wound by putting her on tableside, but on tableside, she does pretty poorly, where her first salad gets out and then it's not well received, and then another customer needs her to cut the lettuce for them. But when she moves on to flambés, although she does get off to a little bit of a tough start, she eventually finds her groove and manages to satisfy all the customers. I will say this though, she does pull Ralph off to the side afterward and tells him to nominate her, which is not a good look on Elsie's part that she wants to quit. Ultimately though, she's not nominated, so whatever. And then we get to her boot episode, which is pretty notorious in Hell's Kitchen, though I will say there are a lot of wonky circumstances to Elsie's boot. She gets off to a really good start in the Leftovers challenge, where despite making a simple chicken soup, which Chef Ramsay gets worried about due to its color, he finds it delicious and ends up making Elsie the winner of the challenge. And she gets to appear on TV showing some TV hosts how to cook, but this causes animosity with the contestants who all decide to plot against her. And then in dinner service, she gets to choose where each chef goes to start off with, and while she does pretty decent when she's on that station, the chefs ultimately get switched around after about an hour, and after that, Elsie completely falls off and has a complete meltdown. Sometimes she would need to get bailed out by her teammates in that service, but other times they just deliberately didn't help her as it was all part of the sabotage. But Elsie was doing so poorly and she got so much in the weeds that Chef Ramsay had to pull her to the side which is really not a good look. And he even sends her away for a break before she comes back, but it's too late and tables begin to walk out and the service shuts down. She is nominated that night, but I personally think that despite the sabotage, she did deserve to survive over Jessica, as Jessica was the weaker chef up to that point, and she also made her fair share of mistakes that night despite being switched around. Though I'd argue Elsie got more so screwed by the switching of the stations, as she had it planned out, and had she stayed on that station, I do think she would have survived that night, but because Chef Ramsay switched around the stations, and because of the sabotage that was going on from the others, she stood no chance. And while you can knock Elsie a little bit for not catching on to the sabotage, I think the switching of the stations is what did her in more so. And then she comes back for the finale, where she's surprised to be one of the last people selected. And she doesn't have the greatest finale service in the world, as she accidentally puts plastic in a salad with Michael threatening to kill her because it came back, and her even getting into an argument with Jessica, who was about to take over her station. But eventually things settle down and she helps Michael win. Overall, I think Elsie was a pretty strong chef this season, despite not having much kitchen experience, and she did really well in essentially all of the challenges. And although she had a couple of dinner service hiccups, she managed to mostly balance it out and do really well, almost making it to the end, and in my opinion should have made it further than some of the previous chefs that we talked about, including Jessica. But for me, she's here at number 3. Up next at number 2, and obviously we have the final 2 chefs of the season, and it's just a matter of deciding which one is better than the other. But at number 2, I decided to go with the runner-up of the season in Ralph. And Ralph actually has a pretty good runner-up game for the most part, but it's not without its flaws. He doesn't get off to the greatest start in the world in episode 1, where in the signature dish challenge he serves a tuna with cold noodles, but Chef Ramsay doesn't like it, and after he asserts himself as number 1 in his restaurant, Chef Ramsay uses the opportunity to make fun of him. But he does have a good service where, despite him having to wait tables, his performance is well received by the customers. He also has a good performance in episode 2 where, despite his team losing, he's one of 2 people to clean 2 squids in the squid cleaning challenge alongside Mary Ellen, and he's on the garnish station in dinner service and has to bail Wendy out on appetizers, helping to get refires out, with Ramsay even praising him for his teamwork. Episode 3 is another really good episode for Ralph, arguably even better than his previous 2 episodes, where in the 5-course meal challenge he manages to tie the round with Jeff after serving roasted corn chowder. And in dinner service, he takes the leadership role, helping out Jessica when she needs it and having to bail out Wendy when she struggles on the meat station, with Chef Ramsay praising him for his communication and teamwork and also giving him a best of the worst at that service. He also does pretty decent in episode 4 where he's on the fish station for dinner service, and he's also working desserts, with his desserts getting accepted, although he doesn't win the best of the worst in this service, with Jessica winning it instead. Episode 5 for him is a little bit of a mixed bag, where at first he's in the dining room and manages to charm the customers as he did with the first service, but when he goes into the kitchen it's not so great, as he does have tortellini come up to the pass but gets it turned back due to splashes of tomato on the plate, and he also does get into an argument with Andrew, but the blue team wins that service, so once again it doesn't really matter. Then we get to episode 6, which I think is actually a pretty bad episode for Ralph. He gets off to a bad start in the blind taste test challenge, where he only tastes 2 items, but he misses both of those, causing the blue team to lose. And then he takes charge for the battle of the menu dinner service, even shooting down the ideas of Jessica and Andrew. And he's on the dessert station for dinner service, while Andrew and Jessica have to cook the main courses, except for Ralph's flourless chocolate cake. But the dishes come back to the past, with John Philippe telling him and Andrew that the fish is overcooked and tasteless. And he also gets distracted during dinner service with some customers, with Chef Ramsay calling him out for it. And he continues to call him out during the post-mortem, and although Ralph isn't nominated by Jessica, who wins best of the worst in that service, Chef Ramsay goes out of his way to call him down with Andrew, mostly due to the fact that it was Ralph's menu and his items that came back, which made him look bad. And although he survived over Andrew, and I don't think he had much of a chance of going home, it definitely was a bad look for him. Although he does get it together in time for the Black Jackets. But he doesn't get off to the greatest start, as in the fruit flambe challenge, his dish is good, but he forgets a critical component of the flambe by forgetting to dust his fruits with icing sugar, and as a result he's not in contention for being the winner of the challenge. But his dinner service is much better, as him and Michael get the Black Jackets off to a hot start by setting appetizers out in record time, with Chef Ramsay even praising Ralph for his plating and also his cooking, with him earning another best of the worst at the end of that service. And then we get to episode 8, which is kind of a mediocre episode for Ralph, as he doesn't get off to the greatest start in the leftovers challenge, where although his presentation is spot on, his dish has raw onions, which ultimately ruins it. And he's not seen that much on dinner service, probably the least out of everyone there, as he starts off on the meat station but then gets switched to the fish station and then the garnish station. And while he does pretty decent that night, he does have a hiccup at one point with his steak getting sent upside down at one point. Although looking at the four of them, I think Ralph was probably in the least danger to go home, maybe second to Michael, but he did pretty good that night compared to the others. He has another good episode in episode 9 where in the perfect souffle challenge, despite his dish needing more egg whites, it's the best out of the 3 souffles, and he also gets first choice for his protein with him choosing beef. And then he's on the garnish station at dinner service with him also having to cook his filet mignon dish, and although there were delays in getting the filet mignons out to the customers, it wasn't Ralph's fault. When it does get out to the customers, it's well received by them, and it's also the most ordered of the 3 entrees with 42 orders out of the entire dining room. Although his dinner service is not flawless, as he does have a communication problem with Michael over temperatures on a certain order, but he does quickly solve it. And then at the elimination, his beef entree places second out of the 3, getting 3 votes out of 9, with Michael getting 5 and Jessica getting the last one, earning Ralph his spot in the final 2. And then we have his finale episode, which, let's not beat around the bush, is an episode that for Ralph is not very good. He makes a steak for the final signature dish challenge with him racking up some points, although after Michael takes a lead, he tries to pitch his food out to some customers with it initially working, although it eventually completely flounders with him scoring only half the points that Michael does. He also has some issues where he practices running the pass where, although he gets off to a good start with Chef Ramsay praising him for his charisma, Michael makes him look stupid by sabotaging the risotto and not putting crab in it multiple times with him failing to spot it, and when he finally does spot it, Chef Ramsay chews him out for having a lack of quality control and not tasting his dishes. He also has further quality control problems when he tries to send out a messed up salmon. And then comes his picks for the final dinner service, which are a little bit questionable, although it is somewhat understandable as Michael threw Ralph a curveball by picking Jessica first, but then he picks Andrew and Wendy, who were really weak. And the main reason I consider these to be questionable picks is because I would have chosen Elsie before Andrew or Wendy. Heck, I would have even chosen Jimmy before Andrew or Wendy, which says a lot in my opinion. And then his final dinner service isn't that great as he tries to micromanage his brigade, especially Wendy, who gets confused on the appetizer station with his order and also not having enough pans, with Ralph having to jump in and spending more time with her than on the hot plate, with him getting called out by Chef Ramsay over it. But he does manage to appease the customers with a tableside appetizer, which is well received. And although Ralph doesn't have that many more hiccups that night, his brigade is a different story, which I think is part of the reason why he loses at the end, but also the fact that he spent a lot of time away from the hot plate and also Michael managing to essentially come full circle that season. I will also say that I do think Ralph was a bit more visible in the edit at times compared to Michael, although what we saw of him was kind of mixed at times again. He did have instances of great leadership and great cooking, but also some instances of him kind of being a control freak and micromanaging everyone, with some examples being in the Battle of the Menus and in the final dinner service. So I think Ralph is a really good chef from the season, but there were points where he got outclassed by Michael, and he was nominated by Chef Ramsay at one point, whereas Michael was never nominated over the course of the season. But he is the runner-up of the season and the second greatest chef here at number 2. And finally, at number 1, the best chef from Hell's Kitchen Season 1 is, unsurprisingly, the winner of the season. We got Michael Ray. Now, I will say that Michael's edit, especially in the beginning, is a lot more quiet, but he's also shown making much less mistakes than Ralph is. And though he gets off to a little bit of a slow start, he begins to pick it up and become much more dominant as the season progresses. He doesn't have the greatest premiere of the world as he presents scallops with quail eggs for his signature dish, and Chef Ramsay even hasn't tasted, to which Michael says is not bad, but Chef Ramsay calls him out for having the palate of a cow's backside. And his dinner service is just kind of fine, as he's the only one from the blue team to respond to Chef Ramsay calling out the first order, and although he does run out of lobster spaghetti at one point, he does quickly recover and find some more. He's kind of invisible in episode 2 where he has to sit out of the squid cleaning challenge due to the fact that he's cleaned squids before, and in dinner service he's not seen that much, but what we do see of him is kind of negative, with Chef Ramsay calling him out for complaining about how hot it was in the blue kitchen, but they win that service, so again, it doesn't really matter. He has a pretty decent episode 3, and this is the episode where he switched over to the red team to even out the deficit. And he makes a good first impression in the 5-course meal challenge where he presents a grilled pork, with Chef Ramsay kind of calling him a smartass over it, but Chef Ramsay finds the dish to be delicious and he scores the point in that round. But his dinner service is a little bit of a mixed bag, as he makes 2 dishes for the critics, one of which is a crab risotto and the other one is a lamb dish, with his crab risotto being pretty poorly received by the critics, but his lamb dish receives great reviews. He also has a pretty good episode in episode 4 where he's on the fish station, and both him and Chris are the main contributors to helping out their team, especially Elsie, who kind of gets in the weeds due to her panic attack, and their teamwork leads to them winning the service. But then we get to episode 5, which is where I think Michael really kicks it up a notch. On dinner service, he's on the dessert station, and although he doesn't really help his team out much, he does do a very good job in getting desserts out to the customers. And he also makes a strategic move when the red team is in the dining room, trying to push lasagna onto the customers, which a lot of them do end up doing, and sabotages the blue team, although the red team did lose that service. But Michael's named best of the worst, and that's when he makes his biggest strategic move by taking out Chris, who he sees as his biggest competition, and it actually worked, which is just crazy to see something like this pulled off in Hell's Kitchen. But it actually worked to his benefit, as he started to come out of Chris's shadow in episode 6, getting off to a not so great start in the blind taste test where he does go 0 for 1, but the red team had a lead and won the challenge, so it didn't really matter too much. And for the Battle of the Menus dinner service, he's on the meat station coming up with a filet mignon for the red team's menu, and it receives great reviews when it gets out to the customers. He also has to bail out Jimmy, who struggles with scallops but manages to get them sent out. And as I alluded to earlier, Chef Ramsay praises Michael at the end of the service for coming out of Chris's shadow and doing his own thing. And then when it's time for the Black Jackets, he gets off to a pretty decent start, although it's not so great for the flambe challenge, where although the taste is nice, the presentation is pretty dirty, with Chef Ramsay comparing it to Jimmy's dirty plates. And then in dinner service, he's on the dessert station, with him and Ralph getting the Black Jackets off to a really good start, and he also has to bail out Jessica, who almost runs out of filet mignons, but he comes to the rescue and gets her more. Episode 8 for Michael isn't too great, as he doesn't get off to a good start in the leftovers challenge, where he serves a pasta dish with chicken wings, which looks nice but tastes really bad, and he also forgets to take the bones off the chicken, which is a really bad look there. And in dinner service, he starts on the garnish station where he has to bail out Jessica once again as she needs help with the refires, but then he gets switched over to the appetizer station where he sees Elsie struggle and he has to bail her out as well, and then he switched over to the meat station, but Jessica once again flounders. So a lot of bad things happen, but none of these are Michael's fault, with Chef Ramsay reminding him that he couldn't carry an entire kitchen on his back and that he did a lot of good things that night, but they weren't enough. His episode 9 is just kind of fine, as in the Perfect Souffle challenge, his dish is criticized for not having that much sugar, but he comes in second and chooses the tuna dish for that night's dinner service. And he's on the appetizer station along with having to cook his sesame tuna, and although the loved ones like it, the customers' reviews are a lot more mixed. But him and Ralph get the kitchen off to a good start, only for him to have to bail out Jessica once again when she struggles with the desserts. And he even takes over her chicken station because she just can't get it together. He does have a little bit of a communication problem with Ralph over one of the orders, but that's about the extent of his screw-ups. And at the end, his tuna dish receives the most votes from the loved ones with 5, compared to Ralph getting 3 and Jessica only getting 1, which leads to Michael entering the final 2. And he kicks his strategy into overdrive in the final episode. For the final signature dish challenge, he comes up with a braised short rib dish, and although it's pretty tight in the beginning, he does end up scoring double the points that Ralph does and wins the challenge 12-6. Then him and Ralph practice running the pass, and although he doesn't get off to the greatest start as he's not loud enough when he calls out the first order, he takes it in stride and gradually becomes more assertive as he keeps practicing, with Chef Ramsay reminding him to keep doing that when it's time for the final service. And then when it's Ralph's turn to run the pass, Michael sabotages him by intentionally forgetting to put crab in the risotto, and he lets it get past Ralph multiple times before Ramsay has to remind Ralph that there's no crab in the risotto. I do also like his picks for his brigade, as him picking Jessica first really just threw Ralph for a loop, and was another instance where he showed he could outplay Ralph. Now I will say that I would have chosen Elsie over Jimmy, but he does end up choosing her at the end of the day, so it doesn't really matter. His final dinner service gets off to a little bit of a rocky start, as when he calls out the first order, his team didn't answer immediately, and he has to get them to do it anyway, with his brigade having problems of their own, as both Jessica and Jimmy get confused on orders, leading to them getting mixed up. Despite this, appetizers begin to get sent out at a rapid rate until one of Elsie's salads comes back with a piece of plastic in it, with Michael threatening to kill Elsie if she did it again. And then an argument breaks out between Jessica and Elsie, with Michael having to step in and separate them. He begins to grow much more assertive throughout the night as appetizers finish up and entrees get out at a fast pace just like appetizers did earlier, until an undercooked steak comes back into the kitchen with him having to tell Jimmy to refire it. The refire gets accepted and dinner service finishes without any further problems. And while it is close in the end, Michael does end up winning due to both his strategy and his improving leadership skills, along with him becoming much more assertive throughout the night, which led to all of these factors combining and giving him the win. As a whole, Michael's game is pretty clean this season, especially with a lot of chefs making a handful of mistakes. I will say that there could be an argument for Michael being below Ralph, especially considering the fact that Ralph seemed to be more out in front, but at the end of the day, Michael was never nominated for elimination, while Ralph was nominated once by Chef Ramsay, which in my opinion is a pretty bad look. So, all in all, I think Michael is the best chef from the season, and he's here at number 1. Alright, that'll conclude my ranking of the chefs from Hell's Kitchen Season 1 based on how I think they performed on this season. Let me know what you agree and disagree with, and what your personal rankings of the chefs is in the comments. Anyway, that is the end of the video. My name is Owen, and I'll catch you guys next time in the front yard. Take care.